Welcome back to Midwest Mind Melt. I'm Jason.
I'm Josh.
And today in the studio with us we have a guest, Ridge, who has law enforcement experience in the state of Nebraska. So we're going to ask him some questions and kind of probe his knowledge on technology and how it's assisted law enforcement in their day-to-day duties, and just have him kind of chime in on his opinions about technology. So how's everybody doing tonight?
I'm not doing too bad, Jason. Rich, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, Josh. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, no problem, man.
So I guess one of the first things I want to know, or I guess I want to ask you is, have you seen any like crazy technological advances in the equipment that you guys use from day to day? I guess one of the biggest things that I've noticed, and I don't know about in your experience, is body cams. Have those assisted and made things easier for you guys? With any suspects or any things that you guys have to do?
Well, the big thing, especially with body cameras, law enforcement, it's one of the branches of public service, just like your firefighter, just like your EMS, and etc. And we're always going to be in the public eye. And the current climate is very against law enforcement. You're seeing it on the national level. You're seeing it, especially on the West Coast, on the local levels. Portland's a mess right now. Body cams only stand to benefit officers in the long run. We can refer to them back for report writing. It tends to cover our asses, for lack of a better term, when it comes to contacts with the public, especially if we're accused of misconduct. It's a huge tool that we have. It helps with documentation is the biggest thing. We can use it for documentation. We can refer back to it, and quite frankly, officers that don't want to wear body cameras, you probably have something to hide. And so if you're unwilling to do that, we probably need to look at the root causes of why. So
I've seen videos, and obviously YouTube's a great thing for this, where officers will like turn their body cams off. Like, would you say that in itself causes a big issue for you guys? Just like with your, like, not for you in general, but just as an officer, like you said, if they're not wearing them or they're doing things like that, should they really be in a position to serve the general public?
Generally, if somebody's turning their body cameras off, there's usually a disciplinary repercussion for that, whether it be a policy violation. Generally, administration will frown upon that. There might be certain times, I haven't run across any, but there might be certain times where if you're interviewing a subject that's sensitive or something like that, you might go away from the body cameras in lieu of a more traditional method of recording that. And that can be for a multitude of reasons, confidentiality, etc. Internal affairs would be another one. Just situations like that. You're going to want to keep yourself covered, but there are times where it would be inappropriate. But generally that has a sign off way above your standard line officer's head. That's generally going to be more an administrative move.
Have you run into any situations where technology's actually made your job harder?
I guess not really made my job more difficult. There's been situations where I've definitely had to be more aware of what I'm doing. Obviously, look at these recordings that you're seeing now that are cropping up on YouTube about, law enforcement agents that are, going about things the wrong way or something, and there's this video taken by the public that looks bad. Well, it's not so much me in general, but when you have a video that comes across like that doesn't catch the entire story or catch the tail half of an incident, it tends to just look bad on law enforcement in general. So, for an example, you can have a video of a police officer uses a straight arm bar takedown and throws a 70-year-old woman on her face. Now, it looks bad in that context, but what led up to that? There's so many more things that lead up to that incident. There could be weapons involved. There could be, assaults. There could be any number of things that have led up to that incident that has caused that officer to use that amount of force that he felt was appropriate. And when you don't tell the whole story, you're open to misinterpretation and false criticisms.
So, in your opinion, would you say that might have been one of the issues with the Freddie Gray incident back a few years ago, where they didn't have the entire story of what happened, and obviously those officers were placed under administrative leave, but so in a situation like that, that's where technology would benefit you guys?
Absolutely.
I guess I kind of want to step back a little bit and ask you, You personally, what was one of your reasons for wanting to get into law enforcement?
Um, I chuckle because most people want to give, the academy answer. I want to protect and serve. I want to make my community better. When I interviewed for my position, I told the agency that I was interviewing, they asked me, that was the last question I interviewed. Why do you want to be a cop? And I thought about, the poster boy, the academy answer, and that's just not me. They asked why I want to be a cop. I said I want to put bad people behind bars. I want to put dirtbags behind bars.
Right.
Because you can make your community safer, you can do all those things, but at the end of the day, you're putting bad people behind bars, and that's why I chose to do what I want to do.
That's a pretty solid answer, I think. But I guess getting back to technology, would you say that officers today have an easier or harder time than officers back before dash cams, before the cameras were put on them? We're talking previous generations, previous decades. Would you think officers back then had it easier, or do you think they have it easier today?
In some aspects, they have it easier, and in some aspects, it's more difficult. Take for example, in the 60s. The 60s was a different time. The country generally had law enforcement's back. But also in the 60s, there were a lot of policies that were very crippling to officers. And now I'll use an example. California Highway Patrol back in the 60s had a very, very good public view. They were very, very well seen by the community, and it ultimately ended in a lot of problems for California Highway Patrol. I don't know if either one of you are familiar with the Newhall shooting. The Newhall shooting was in the 60s or 70s, late 60s, early 70s. But the Newhall shooting stems back to a policy that California Highway Patrol and a lot of California agencies had where they were not allowing officers to use the amount of force necessary. In the 60s and 70s, most law enforcement agents in California did not carry a backup shotgun in their car. The shotgun can be a very useful tool in law enforcement. And when they did finally implement them, they were sealed, they were left with unloaded chambers, and anytime that seal was broken, you immediately had a meeting with your supervisor, who then had to write a report. So there was a culture against using force. Now in the Newhall incident, there were multiple officers shot and killed because they did not use force at the time that they should have. And there was a technological aspect of that too. They were using 6-shot revolvers, and we've obviously moved on to the semi-automatics, your Glocks, your Smith & Wessons, your 6 Hours, and that played part way into it. But the culture against law enforcement now is the advantage that the old law enforcement agents had. They didn't have the negative public eye that we do. Now, as far as the new officers and the way that they're looked on, they do have that negative public image, which makes the job more difficult. However, we have body cams, we have dash cameras, we have audio recorders, we have PBT machines. We have so many more tools at our disposal that helps us do our jobs more effectively. It helps us document our jobs better so we can write better reports and make sure the facts are conveyed accurately. Because you can have all the facts you want, but if you're misrepresenting those facts, it's another deception tactic that I'm personally against. You want to document your incidents accurately, and that's the big thing, is people don't think that law enforcement will report incidents accurately. That's where part of the distrust comes from. The guy had a gun, and it turns out he did, or he didn't have a gun, and he did, and that's where, a lot of the scrutiny comes in.
Yeah, me and Josh had talked about that in an earlier episode of the podcast where we talked about the recent mass shootings, and one of the biggest one was the Vegas shooting where things weren't accurately reported. But sticking to a note about the shooting you were just talking about, do you think if more people knew or educated themselves, and me and Josh talk a lot about education on our podcast, but do you think that if people educated themselves a little more on shootings like that, obviously officers died because they didn't use force, people would be a little more, wouldn't have such a negative view of law enforcement today because they would understand that there's a reason why that escalation of force took place and why those principles were implemented. Do you think that would change any kind of view in the public's eyes at all?
Well, I think it would if the public was receptive to that kind of education. You know, well, Josh, I don't know, does the audience know about your former career?
Yes, they know about my former corrections, and
Okay.
just for you though, for those of you who are not aware, me and Ridge actually met working at the state penitentiary. So just so you all know.
Most of the public is they're generally uneducated when it comes to use of force by law enforcement and corrections, how it's implemented, why it's implemented, and what situations can constitute a use of force. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, and that's part of the problem. There's an article on Police One, and I think everybody, whether or not you want to be in law enforcement, should read it. And it's called the 10 Deadly Mistakes, I think is what it is. It's on Police One website, which is a great tool for law enforcement. It talks a lot about policy. It talks a lot about training. I highly encourage anybody. I'm not getting paid to say this. It's just a tool that I use. But it talks about 10 very big mistakes that you can make as a law enforcement agent that can lose you your life. It was actually written by an officer a law enforcement officer who the way he worded it is I've been to too many law enforcement funerals. And one of those, it talks about situational awareness. Watch their hands. Know the person you're talking to, know how to communicate with them. There's a lot that goes into it, and I think the general public doesn't understand. If you approach somebody, if you let's say you're sent on a call for a domestic dispute, very, very common call to be sent on is a domestic dispute. Generally, there has been an assault on one side or both sides. Many times there can be a weapon involved. Most of your law enforcement agents get killed on domestic disturbances. It's a death trap. You don't know what you're going into if you've got a call of yelling, screaming from a house. Generally, your 911 calls are not very clear. They're not conveying the information that you need to. So you go to that situation, and all of a sudden you have a guy who's very angry, who thinks he might be going to jail, and you can't see his hands. You're in a very bad position. If you can't see his hands, you don't know what's in his hands. And that's kind of where you'll see a lot of these things where he shot an unarmed man. He shot an unarmed man. Well, he didn't know that at the time. Most people don't understand that you can armchair quarterback a use of force, whether it be deadly force or less lethal force. You can armchair quarterback that all day long. But you have to look at what information did the officer have at the time of the incident. What did they see? What did they observe? What did they hear? You won't know. And that's where the body cam footage has come from. If you're approaching an individual and you can't see his hands and they're behind his back, you don't know what's in his hands. If he makes a quick reach for his waistband, most people carry their concealed weapons legally or illegally on their waistband. There's a lot of things that go into that I think the public, I don't know if they don't understand, but it's a situational awareness thing that not everybody possesses.
I would definitely say that they don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately.
Well, how many times did you get nervous when we worked at the pen when you didn't see an inmate's hands, especially a known troublemaker?
Oh yeah, I can't even tell you how many times.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I agree. And to add on to Jason's question, I guess I want to ask you, there's been a lot of movies centered around cops, so obviously Hollywood is very interested in law enforcement. And I just want to get your take on, do you think these characters that they portray, do you think this has had a positive or a negative impact on law enforcement?
Well, it depends on the character. I mean, if you have a renegade rogue cop that's playing by his own rules, I mean, it makes for a hell of a good movie. But does it accurately portray the job and the people that are doing it on a day-to-day basis? Absolutely not.
And that's what I was going to say, because it seems like because movies that come to mind right away, Street Kings, The Departed, I mean, these movies always portray crooked cops. So you're always seeing, cops as the bad guy in a lot of these movies. But then when you get movies where the cop is the hero, it's always something that just wouldn't work out in real life, because it is a cop that goes rogue, one that plays by his own rules and doesn't do things by the book. And it's just, to me, it just tells me that, like, if a rookie went in there and did that, it would just be disastrous for them. It would be career suicide.
Absolutely. If a rookie walks in and plays Mel Gibson from Lethal Weapon. They're going to walk his ass out. If he's lucky, he's going to be carrying a box of his stuff. If he's unlucky, he's going to be walked out in handcuffs.
Or John McClane from Die Hard.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You can't have a renegade cop going nuts and just, shooting bad guys, guns blazing. That's not police work. That's not the way it works.
And that's where that failure of education, whether it be self-education or just even general knowledge, fails us as a society. If people, there's a lot of people who get that disgust taste in their mouth. Where law enforcement, I'm a huge Live PD fan. I watch a lot of Live PD, and there's certain things like that I see happen that I don't know how I could do it. Like being in that situation, seeing the way that people respond, just because a cop, a police officer, is scared, is not necessarily scared, but he's watching for himself. There was, in fact, one that comes to mind last night. They pulled over a guy. He was in front of his house. But he had his music up too loud, and the cop yelled at him for 5 minutes to open the door and get out of the vehicle. And he just sat there. And so finally when backup showed up, they drug him out, they handcuffed him, they did what they had to do. And then he was all upset about it because they made a big deal about it. But the thing is like you said, you don't know what they have. You walk up to a window, and for all you know, they got a shotgun sitting in their lap, and they're,
If I may tell a story. So I had an incident. I had an individual who he was speeding down the road. I was traveling the opposite direction. I activated my radar. He was traveling well over the posted speed limit. I turned around on this individual, activated my overhead lights, made myself visible, and conducted a traffic stop. No sooner had I put my vehicle in park, notified dispatch on the radio that I was on a traffic stop, this individual had opened his driver's side door, got out, and started walking towards me. Now, most people wouldn't think that's a big deal. Now, understand, I'm in a marked cruiser, overhead lights. Everybody knows that I'm a law enforcement agent. They know what I'm doing. Now, normal procedure for us at that point is felony stop procedures at that point. You do not know what that individual is doing. I held that individual with my service weapon. I called for backup. I had that backup come. That individual was placed in restraints. He was eventually released, but he stopped and he freaked out when I had to point my sidearm at him. He freaked out and I said, "What are you doing?" When I finally had gotten up to him, he told me, "Oh, I thought I had a tail light out." And that's why he pulled me over, so I stopped to check. Folks, if you're listening, don't get out of your car during a traffic stop, please. That looks bad. Because one time he's getting out and he's checking his tail light. The next time, he's got his trunk popped and he's grabbing an AR, or he's grabbing an AK, or he's grabbing a shotgun. It doesn't matter. Don't do that. And another thing while we're on that subject, you're going to make a cop a lot more nervous if you're moving around in your cabin a lot. If I see you moving around, opening your center console, stuff like that, you might be looking for your license and your registration stuff, and that's fine, but it makes me nervous. It makes everybody nervous. A lot of people forget that behind the badge is we're just people. We want to go home to our family. We want to go home to our friends, our pets.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do anything to startle somebody. And I don't mean to say that as law enforcement agents are easily startled. We deal with a lot of different things, but it's misunderstandings in situations like that cause a lot of these problems. Look at the incident where I can't remember the guy's name, but he was shot reaching for his wallet where he had his concealed weapon. He was shot in the passenger side of the vehicle. You guys remember what the situation I'm talking about? That was a misunderstanding that unfortunately ended in a loss of life. It's stuff like that you got to be careful.
So another question I have is, do you feel like technology and the use of social media, having social media at our hands, because I'm pretty sure we're all old enough to remember when MySpace was a thing and when Facebook first started and when Instagram was a thing and Snapchat. Do you feel like the use of social media at our hands with technology has made it harder, and not necessarily harder, but harder on you guys, but easier for people to do illegal things, whether it be obtain drugs or big thing is like underage sex, stuff like that. Do you feel like that, like technology's kind of made your guys' jobs harder in that aspect?
Well, that's kind of a tough question because in the time before social media, there was still crime. There was still lots of it and everything. Has it made it the distribution, of drugs, and stuff like that easier? Sure, absolutely. It's easier to network with somebody, especially if you live in a big Midwestern city like St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, any towns like that, that you could very well live in Chicago your entire life, and there will be people that live down the street from you that you'll never meet. But with the use of social media, you can network with somebody clear across town. However, the digital footprint that you leave behind also makes it easier to track those people down, catch that kind of stuff. So it's a double-edged sword in that respect, and that's why a technological background for anybody who's wanting to get into law enforcement, a technological background always stands to serve you better, especially if you want to work on the state or federal law enforcement level. That's a lot of it. Anything that crosses state lines is federal jurisdiction. A lot of that's going to be through your digital footprint. So absolutely, it's made things easier, but it's also made things more difficult. It's just it's helped crime evolve, but it's also helped law enforcement evolve with it.
So really, as the times changed, it's really just everybody's changed. So there really hasn't been a big effect either way. Essentially,
no, it's not like the Prohibition times when law enforcement agents were carrying cult police positives, and the Al Capone crew was carrying Thompson submachine guns. It's not that kind of disadvantage anymore. Law enforcement has evolved with the times, and it will continue to evolve.
I was going to say, because I've heard a lot of cases where people, because they posted incriminating things on social media and their location gave them up. And so I've heard of, officers were able to find them based on their location from their Facebook status.
Well,
so...
To be candid, criminals are not the smartest people out there. If they were, they wouldn't be caught.
Yeah, most of them are not. I learned that in corrections.
Mm-hmm. So, go ahead, Josh.
No, you go ahead, Jason.
So, just to touch on in your experience, because me and Josh talked the drug epidemic a couple episodes back, and we kind of talked about how the Midwest kind of works as a central hub for the United States. In your experience, how often do you run into drugs when you're dealing with, even just a traffic stop?
Well, it's hit or miss. There are nights, that I've worked where I've, made contact with 3 or 4 people that have had stuff on them, and then I've gone a week without making contact with anybody that did. It's really hit or miss. There's a couple of older guys in the department that I work on. They can pick a car out from a mile away, and I just don't have that kind of experience. Those old guys, they've been doing this job a long time. But you see a lot of stuff that rolls through the Midwest. There was actually a law enforcement agent from Nebraska. He's a Nebraska State Patrol trooper, Sam Mortensen. He grew up down in western Nebraska, and he was recently honored by President Donald Trump for the largest fentanyl bust in the United States. On Interstate 80 rolling through the middle of Nebraska, he found enough, I think that the way that they had described it was enough fentanyl to kill 250,000 people.
That's ridiculous.
And so, you can have one of those days, or, it can be, traffic stops and registration tickets all day long. It's really hit or miss. And that's why I love law enforcement. It's never the same thing twice.
And at the end of the day, it's not about getting the most recognition for what you do. It's about doing what you love and enjoying what you do.
Yeah. Sam probably saved a lot of people's lives by pulling that fentanyl off the road.
Absolutely.
There's a ripple effect to law enforcement. A lot of people don't want to see that side of it. They just want to look at cops as the bad guys.
So there was a post going around Facebook. Ever since we started doing the podcast, I've kind of been trolling social media a little more to get topics to talk about. And I was really curious, but apparently there's a protest for the, obviously you heard about the shooting in Philadelphia, where 6 cops got injured. As far as the last thing I heard, none of them died. So that's awesome. We love to hear that. But what's your take on a situation like that?
Well, to be honest, I've heard about the incident, but I haven't looked at it very much. And, there's so many facts that haven't come out. But what I can say is, given the information that I have now, we have an individual who is a known felon
who has known violent tendencies, fired on officers and injured 6 of them. And we have people that are going to go to, they're organizing this protest or this rally in defense of this individual. Now, personally, I think that's crap. I think people are smarter than that.
Yeah.
But, sorry.
Well, the post had kind of talked about, and it was just a small post from a friend that I know that lives in Philadelphia, actually, that it was only going to be 200 or 300 people. Now, Philadelphia is one of the people don't know this, but it actually there's a lot of crime in Philadelphia. It's probably one of the bigger crime town or cities in the United States, and I think that the general public needs to realize that trying to defend somebody who, like you said, at the end of the day, behind the badge, you guys are all people, and you want to go home to your families too, and it kind of makes you wonder why somebody would go to that extreme and do something so heinous, and then he has people that are defending him because of the way that the police handled that situation. How else would you have expected that situation to be handled?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, nobody, including the suspect, died. I mean, that's the big protest, is that, cops are killers, cops are killing black people, cops are killing minorities, cops are the enemy, cops are agents of the government, cops are glorified tax collectors. At the end of the day, that guy was not killed when, given the situation that was happening, he held 2 law enforcement officers hostage and shot 6 more. By all rights, lethal force would have been very justified at that point. Those officers showed a lot of restraint. There was actually a situation, while we're on the subject, that just recently happened in Wahoo, Nebraska, which is the eastern part of the state. There was a man who, Wahoo police was dispatched to this individual's house for a domestic dispute. This individual ended up getting in his semi-tractor, tried to run over a law enforcement officer who had to dive behind a tree in order to avoid being ran over. And this individual then backed out of that yard and ran over 2 police cruisers and ran the 2 cruisers and the semi into a yard and assaulted a police officer with a baseball bat. And not a single shot was fired during that incident. Again, another situation where deadly force was very justified at that point. By running down that police officer in a semi, that's attempted murder. That is a deadly force assault that can be met with deadly force to defend that officer's life. So the fact that people will condemn cops for situations like that, it's clear that they don't understand how force is applied in law enforcement. Force is applied to gain compliance. And it is what they use is what they call 1+1 theory. Okay, so you offer this level of resistance, I'm going to use a level of control that is 1 step higher. It's called the 1+1 theory. So if you're giving me verbal noncompliance, for example, I am going to use verbal direction. You're not doing it, I'm telling you to do it. And then you have, it's use of force in itself is a science. You have, anybody that's interested, you can Google the use of force continuum and it will give you a brief example of use of force, levels of resistance and levels of control. So a deadly force assault is the highest level of resistance, and that can be met with deadly force, which is the highest level of control. Understanding that, I think, would end a lot of these kind of protests and stuff, because they would more understand how force is applied and how force is trained to be used in law enforcement. And corrections is the same way. But then, we've circled again back to education. Yeah. People need to be educated on what and how. Okay, there's a time to be non-compliant, there's a time to be compliant.
I guess, because I agree with everything you just said, but I guess my take is a little bit more harsh towards the public who participate in these protests, like the one we're talking about in Philadelphia. Now, before I go off on a giant rant, I would love to talk to somebody from that neighborhood, that area, because obviously it's more of a rundown area of Philadelphia. And I would like to understand where they're coming from. What details is the news not reporting, since we know there's so much inconsistency that you guys are protesting? Because by the sounds of it, it sounds like that gentleman was very lucky to escape with his life. And he didn't escape, but you know what I mean. He didn't get killed when he was... he had the recipe going for for death.
His
Justifiably.
killing would have been justified by law enforcement.
From the details we got, absolutely. But to me, it's just, I don't even know if it's an education thing anymore. I don't even know if it's people, that just a misunderstanding. But honestly, I think it's just a real cowardly thing from people in these areas who just want to condemn cops, and they'll go all day condemning cops because they will tell you, oh, cops are supposed to be of higher morality. But at the same time, people have pointed out over and over again, they do not condemn the drug dealers, not publicly like they do the cops, and they turn a blind eye to, gang members' violence. Because at the end of the day, the cops are held accountable, not just by them, but by their officials and, by the taxpayers. These gang members, these drug dealers, they're not held accountable by anybody except the cops. So, I don't know. To me, it's just, it stirs up a little anger in me.
Well, it's kind of like when you look at like mass shootings and gun violence in general, people don't blame the shooter, they blame the gun. And at the end of the day, it's nothing more than, and we discussed this previously about, it's nothing more than just a tool to get a job accomplished. And I feel like, and me and Josh talked about this too, about during the Obama administration, where it was such a big thing, and he constantly talked about how cops were constantly killing innocent individuals. And like you stated, there's an escalation of force, and the same thing works in the military. Whether it be as an MP, there's obviously escalation of force or rules of engagement that are set down prior to anything being done. And like you said, it's the plus one theory. And it works exactly the same way. And that goes back to that education where people don't understand because they haven't put themselves in that position, or they haven't done their research about it. And in my experience working with cops, I worked retail for 6.5 years, and I dealt with a lot of shoplifters, and I actually got to know the police officers in my town very well. I had their personal phone numbers actually because they said it was faster to call them than to call dispatch. It was kind of funny, but they're generally nice guys, and they're not going to be the first person to just pull out a gun and shoot somebody, And I've had this conversation with multiple people, and like I said, as a civilian, if my life's in danger, and it comes down to him or me, it's going to be him. It's not going to be me. And I know that a lot of people haven't been in that kind of situation. I personally have not been in that situation, but I've had training to prepare myself for that situation. And me and Josh talked about that in our podcast. And it was funny because there was a headline on Facebook about that where Latinos in El Paso were taking more concealed carry classes after what happened in El Paso. And that goes back to that. It doesn't take much to educate yourself on exactly how things work and how the law works. And but then you get those guys, I'm sure you've dealt with them every now and again, that think they know the law more than you do. And those are always the fun guys, right?
I've dealt with many people who believe that they know the law better than I do, and those ones are interesting. Because I'll be the first to admit, there's been a time where I've had to stop, and I've had to go back and get on the internet and check a statute and check a law to make sure that I'm applying it correctly. I have no shame in that, because that means that I'm making sure that I do my job correctly. But I've also run into those that I know my rights people. Most of the time, if you are saying I know my rights, in my personal experience, you generally have a very limited understanding of your rights. And please take a constitutional law class. It will help you in the long run.
Let me ask you this. Have you ever ran into any of those people, like maybe on a simple traffic stop, who like to throw the excuse of, well, my tax dollars pay for this road, so what right do you have to pull me over?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've dealt with that, and my personal opinion is taxation is theft, but that's a conversation for another day.
That's a whole nother subject.
So, would those kind of be like your sovereign citizens, as you want to call them?
Well, the free travelers and sovereign citizens, they make me giggle because you do have a right to travel interstate without papers or licensure to do so. Absolutely. However, you don't have the right to do it while operating a motor vehicle if you don't have a license. The United States Constitution protects your right to own a firearm way more than it protects your privilege to operate a motor vehicle. And using that as an example is a very poor example because, quite frankly, you don't have the right as a quote-unquote free traveler to drive while doing it if you don't have a license. It
So-
is a self-correcting action, is what I like to call that.
So, just for your general opinion, what do you think about the federal legalization of marijuana? What is your opinion on that?
Well, as a public service agent, I will enforce the law as it is written, which means that marijuana in most states in this country and on the federal level are illegal, and the law should be enforced as such. However, on my personal opinion, I can't really speak as to my personal opinion. I haven't done that much research into the positive and the negative effects of it. Now, I understand, that there are positives to it. There's been studies done on it, and quite frankly, in my personal opinion, I think we have bigger issues to worry about than marijuana.
So I recently attended a class with a police officer from Indianapolis, and we kind of discussed the same thing, and he made the comment that he hopes they don't legalize it federally, and I was curious to this because a lot of people say that it would save a lot of problems. Like you said, we have bigger things to worry about than marijuana, but his take on it is marijuana gives him, because it's illegal, it gives him the opportunity to search because he has probable cause now. And do you think that if they legalize marijuana, that would decrease the amount of drugs that are found on a traffic stop involving drugs, or do you think that at the end of the day it's going to be it's going to come down to like, oh, okay, you have this much, I got to take it from you, but we can still let you go?
Well, by that logic, I wouldn't write fix-it tickets anymore, because if you have a taillight out, I have probable cause to stop you and make contact with you. So, by that logic, I understand where he's coming from, but in my experience, if there's marijuana present in a vehicle, and you think that there's more than just marijuana present in that vehicle, there's going to be signs, there's going to be indicators. And quite frankly, generally when I make traffic stops and I notice stuff like that, I don't see, how we would identify it in a report as a green leafy substance. That's how I would identify it, a green leafy substance. I don't generally see that. I'll see a glass bulbous pipe, or I will see a bag with white residue, or I will see any number of things besides marijuana itself that will give me probable cause to initiate a search. So in my opinion, his statement is factual, but again, I don't enforce the law in Indiana in any way. So and their crime patterns might be different than what I'm used to. But in the Midwest, especially in Nebraska, we have more of a methamphetamine issue than we have any other issue.
Yep, we've covered that on previous recordings. Now, you and me both have corrections level with the state, in prison. And just so a lot of you viewers who have heard the words prison and jail used like they're the same, they're not. Jail is before trial and prison is post-trial. Just so you know. But anyway, now you have actual jail experience in corrections.
I have worked corrections on the pre-trial and post-trial level, state prison and county jail levels both.
Now, there's a big fear-mongering statement out there that, our prison system is crowded with guys who have been caught with marijuana. Now, I just want to know, from your experience working the jail, how many guys were in there strictly just for marijuana?
That number is very low. Very, very low. Generally, there are other offenses, and the marijuana is discovered after the search. If they're being arrested for just marijuana, believe you me, it's not a small baggie in their pocket. It's, ounces, pounds, and at that point you're looking at, at least in the state of Nebraska, you're looking at felony possession with intent to deliver, because marijuana is a Schedule I, I believe, controlled substance that is listed by the federal government. So any kind of large volume is going to be a possession with intent to deliver, because that's the way the law is written. And generally, if you have that much to get charged with that, you're most likely not smoking it all yourself.
And that's what I mentioned in a previous conversation, that when I worked in the prison, there wasn't very many guys who were in strictly on marijuana charges. Most of the time it was an added-on charge, but the ones who were in for marijuana, they were dealing pounds and pounds of it and transferring it.
But understand, my experience is a focused experience inside the state of Nebraska. I don't know the East Coast, the West Coast, the South or anything. I don't know their crime statistics. I don't work with that. So this is just my experience in Nebraska. We don't have a lot of people that are in prison for strictly marijuana.
And, honestly, I would guess that even on the East and West Coast, you wouldn't have too many guys in prison just for marijuana, because they have a larger population than we do here in Nebraska, so they got much more crime than we do here in Nebraska. I would find it very hard to believe that their court system would be entertaining cases strictly based on an ounce of weed found in someone's pocket.
And sentencing them to large amounts of
Now,
prison time as a result.
Exactly. One thing I did hear is that Florida, for the longest time, had very strict marijuana laws. You would spend the night in jail if you had a seed in your pocket. But from my understanding, most states are not like that.
So to caveat onto that, and like I said, huge fan of live PD. How does it affect you when you pull somebody over? You're dealing with somebody and they're like, "Hey man, I got some weed on me," and they're upfront from the like you said, nobody's gonna do prison time for a small baggie of weed that they're gonna go home and smoke, and they just happen to get pulled over because they have they have a tail light out. Like if you approach somebody and they're like, "Hey man, I got some weed on me," how would you handle that situation? Because obviously they're not gonna do prison time for that. But are you more inclined to work with them because they were honest, or are you for our listeners, because people need to understand that law enforcement officials are people too, and they understand maybe you're just looking to have a good night, because we know that meth and coke, that's an automatic possession felony regardless of, and I think that's across all states in the United States as far as I know. But obviously marijuana, with the legalization in certain states, if they get caught with a gram, because they were going to go home and smoke it, if they're upfront with you from the very get-go, how does that affect your, how does you as a law enforcement official, are you more inclined to cut them a break and just confiscate it and write them a ticket?
Well, in the state of Nebraska, anything less than 1 ounce is labeled as an infraction. It's a ticketable offense, and depending on it can be a jailable offense, but generally it's a citation. And you have a court date. It's a mandatory court date. You can't just pay a fine. You have to go to court on it. But it is there. And so it really kind of takes my discretion out of it. If they have less than 1 ounce, they get a ticket. It gets confiscated. It gets logged into evidence and subsequently destroyed after the case is finished, after a certain amount of time, which varies by jurisdiction on how long they retain evidence. But when you start getting into the larger amounts, compliance is always a better route to go. Non-compliance is going to be met with, generally the appropriate amount of force. But compliance, it can help you more or less further along the line in the justice system. I know there are a lot of judges around that do take compliance into consideration when it comes to sentencing on a lot of things. That's not just marijuana. That's on a lot of different things. Things are going to go a lot smoother if you're up front, especially if the officer has recognized it, if they detect an odor or something was thrown out, or you drop something as you're going to approach them. Stuff like that compliance is generally going to work in your favor. If anything, I was raised in a way, you be honest, you do your thing, and you pay the consequences, and it just surprises me how many people, can live with themselves and live with their conscience with the things that they do. The long story short, if you own up to it, things are going to go smoother. It's human nature. If you're up front with me, I'm going to be up front with you.
So, I guess the last thing that just for our listeners' perspective, there's a lot of miscommunication with the two terms of one being arrested and two detaining somebody. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay. if somebody's being placed under arrest, I have what I have to do is, in the state of Nebraska at least, I have to fill out a warrantless arrest affidavit, and that is basically where I state the facts of the case as I know them and why I am detaining them, okay, or why I am arresting them. That goes to a judge. The judge reviews that, and if the judge reads that and says the evidence is insufficient to hold this person in jail, you're going to go free. You will still have that charge, but you won't sit in jail. Now, if the judge upholds it, that's where you'll sit in jail. You'll be given a bond. You'll have a bond review, hearing and stuff like that, and you can, and then you have then you're working from the other side of the justice system. Now, if I'm detaining somebody, there could be a situation where I come up to it's like I'll use a domestic disturbance call. I get a call from a concerned neighbor or something that I saw Joe hit Samantha across the street. They were standing in the front yard. They were yelling and screaming, and he backhanded her. Well, if I get up there and Joe's being non-compliant, there's a good chance that I might place Joe in handcuffs and say, "Look, I'm not arresting you yet, but I'm gonna detain you for now. I'm gonna restrain you for my safety, for your safety, and for everybody else's safety, while I sort this out." And there are situations where those handcuffs come off and they stay. They don't go to jail. It just depends on the facts of the case, what's reported to me, how it's reported to me, and then it's handled from there. If you're being detained, it doesn't mean that you're under arrest. To be detained, you don't have to be charged. To be arrested, you have to be charged.
I feel like that's kind of a lot of people don't understand the difference between having military police experience and, again, like having that option to detain somebody, and then when somebody's actually being arrested. That's a very good way to look at it. I've heard it worded several different ways, and that's probably the best that I've heard. And you'll see that a lot if you watch Cops or you watch Live PD or any of those shows. They'll make the comment, as they're putting them in handcuffs, they're like, "I'm just going to restrain you for my safety," because, again, as you stated earlier in the podcast, you don't know exactly if they have something in their waistband. You don't know, you don't know what their intentions are.
They've generally shown a pattern of non-compliance
or violence. If like you said, if you're at a domestic call, and that's one of those things is, if somebody, especially if they're intoxicated, that raises a whole nother distraction you got to worry about, and your safety obviously is priority, but. It's one of those things, a lot of people get that confused. They'd be like, well, if you're going to arrest me for something. Well, you're not necessarily being arrested. I'm just detaining you because I don't know what you're going to do to her if she starts yelling at you. Mm-hmm. So,
and I guess that would be my question. If somebody refuses to be detained, what's the next step?
At that point, there's a lot of things. Generally, a charge like that can be labeled as obstructing a peace officer or obstruction of justice. If you do anything that impedes my ability to do my job effectively, you can be charged with obstruction of justice. That there can, there's a lot of different things that qualify as obstruction, and as far as that goes, I highly encourage anybody and everybody, for a matter of fact, because you do have constitutional rights. Most community colleges offer a constitutional law class. I highly encourage everybody to take it. Because it gives you, when you have a better understanding of how the justice system works, it can make for a smoother path through the justice system, assuming that you end up in it. You have a lot of rights. You have your Fourth Amendment right to unreasonable search and seizure, etc. There's a lot that goes into it, but. Refusing to be detained, you're probably generally going to be charged with obstruction of justice. At very minimum, probably disturbing the peace, depending on what you do. There's a lot that goes into it. I don't have the time to sit here and explain every situation.
No, 100%, we get that. I do have a question for you. I had a buddy tell me about a story. He was stopped by another agency, and they had beer in the trunk of the car. Now, granted, he was driving a car. There were 6 people in the car. So, which tells me there's already a seatbelt infraction, because 6 people aren't going to wear a seatbelt. Mm-hmm. But they got pulled over. The police asked to search the vehicle. He told them no. They searched the vehicle. Apparently, they had probable cause to do so. But they dumped all the beer out. And he asked me from a military police standpoint why somebody would do that, and the only reason I could come up with is, at least the way that I would look at it, is there was only one person that was 21 years of age in the vehicle at the time. So one out of 6 people were old enough to consume that beer, and when you're hauling 3 24 packs of beer in the trunk of the car, obviously somebody's contributing to the delinquency of a minor. How would you have handled that situation?
Well, that's going to depend on a lot of questions that I ask and a lot of answers that are given to me. That can be the whole number of different things. In a situation like that, there's a very real possibility that the 5 minors could have been charged with minor in possession, and the one that was overage would have been charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, possibly up to 5 counts, depending on the situation. I don't know. There's a lot that goes into there. I don't know if they were given citations or anything like that. Sometimes a law enforcement officer can use their discretion and confiscate without ticketing. That's going to be a departmental policy on how they do that. That's there's too many variables there for me to give an accurate opinion as to why it was handled that way.
I completely understand. Well, that's all I got for you tonight. Josh, you got anything else for him?
The only thing is, when we were in corrections, we had an old saying that we would say, and I would like to know if you would like to recite it to our viewers. When dealing with those
with no remorse,
here's to a good use of force.
I like that. That's a good way to look at things. Well, Ridge, I appreciate you for coming out and doing this with us.
I appreciate you having me. It was fun.
Hopefully we'll have you back.
Anytime.
Maybe we'll jump down the rabbit hole next time and talk about some
taxation.
Some taxation, and see how that goes. But again, for our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments,